He thought he was just turning the soil for winter, until his plow hit something that should have never seen daylight. Beneath Eli Granger's quiet farmland lay a sealed hatch, welded shut for generations. What started as curiosity turned into chaos. Crates marked with faded warnings, toxic fumes rising into the cold air, neighbors collapsing, and unmarked vans arriving under floodlights to seize it all. The town was left in silence, poisoned soil underfoot, and questions that will never be answered. What secret was buried beneath a farmer's field? And why was it hidden for 50 years? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning had begun like any other, with the sky still holding the faint gray of dawn, and the air damp with the smell of soil that had been turned countless times before. Eli Granger sat high in the seat of his aging tractor, its steady rumble carrying across the east field like a familiar song he had known all his life. The land had belonged to his father before him, and his father's father before that. Every furrow, every fence post, every stubborn patch of clay carried a memory etched into the Granger family history. It was late autumn, the kind of season where the fields grew quiet and the earth hardened beneath the first hints of frost. Eli had planned to make one last pass before winter set in, breaking the ground so it would breathe through the long, cold months. The first rows came easy, the plow cutting deep into the soil with a rhythm as predictable as Eli's heartbeat. His hands rested on the wheel, not gripping hard, but guiding out of habit, the way one might walk an old road with eyes closed and still know every turn. Then it happened. A jolt, sharp and unnatural, rattled the machine and threw Eli forward against the steering column. The tractor coughed in protest, the plow refusing to move another inch. Eli's first thought was stone. Big ones lurk just under the surface in these fields, carried down from God knows where by glaciers thousands of years ago. But as he shifted the gears to ease the plow back and climbed down to inspect, what he saw didn't look like stone at all. Kneeling at the furrow's edge, he brushed the loose soil away with his callous hand. The ground crumbled easily, revealing something that caught the dull morning light with a glimmer not native to earth. It was metal, iron red and streaked with rust, but deliberate in shape, not like a pipe or an old tool, but flat and broad, stretching wider than his plow blade. He scraped more with his boot, uncovering edges too straight to be nature's work. Eli leaned closer, the smell of old earth and oxidized metal mingling in the chill air, and he felt a knot tighten low in his stomach. This wasn't scrap left behind by some careless farmer. This had been buried. He stood and scanned the horizon, the empty field stretching in every direction, bare except for the jagged teeth of distant tree lines. The Granger farm had always been ordinary. Corn, soybeans, hay in the summer, nothing remarkable. But now, with this piece of rusted iron jutting up through the soil, the ground felt different, like he had plowed into a secret meant to stay hidden. He crouched again, prying at the edges with a small spade. He kept tied to the tractor's frame. The metal gave slightly, enough to reveal length, almost like a lid, the kind that belonged to something meant to be sealed. Eli's mind turned over possibilities as his breath rose in small white clouds. Old machinery abandoned when the war factories closed? A storage tank forgotten by surveyors? Or something else entirely? Something tied to the whispers he'd heard as a boy about the land east of town. Men at the diner had once spoken of bunkers dug during the war, storage places for things the government wanted kept quiet. Eli had never given those stories much weight, but as his shovel struck a seam running along the buried surface, a seam that looked too exact to be an accident, he felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. The tractor still idled behind him, its engine grumbling like it too sensed something was wrong. Eli sat back on his heels, the cold seeping through his worn jeans, and stared at the shape in the dirt. It wasn't stone. It wasn't root. It wasn't anything that belonged in a field meant for planting. It was something else, something made and hidden, waiting in silence until his plow had torn across its back and woken it from the earth's embrace. For the first time in his life on this land, Eli felt unease in his own soil, as if the ground had been holding its breath for generations and had finally exhaled. He wiped his hands on his jacket and stood, eyes fixed on the rusted surface now exposed to the morning light. Whatever lay beneath, it had been put there with intention. And Eli Granger, farmer of simple means and steady work, had just become a man to uncover it. The field was no longer just his family's. It was about to belong to the town, the county, maybe even beyond. He didn't know it yet, but that jolt against his plow had shifted more than metal in the soil. It had stirred the weight of history, and soon everyone would feel it. The east field lay quiet in the days that followed, its furrows darkened by frost and the memory of the plow's sudden halt. Eli avoided the spot where the rusted metal still showed to the soil, though his eyes always strayed there as he passed with tools or buckets in hand. The thing buried beneath his land had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. The Granger farm had always been steady ground, handed down from father to son across 3 generations, a patch of earth that had seen drought and storm, but never mystery. Yet now the soil itself seemed to carry a secret, and Eli couldn't stop turning it over in his mind. The farm was no stranger to history. Beyond the tree line to the west stood the ruins of the old steel foundry, a skeleton of red brick and rusted beams where his grandfather had once worked 12-hour shifts during the war. The place had been the lifeblood of Anvil Creek, its furnaces roaring day and night to supply parts for tanks, ships, and planes. Eli remembered wandering through crumbling walls as a boy, his father pointing out scorch marks on the bricks, telling him how the foundry smoke had once turned the sky black at noon. When the foundry shut down, the town shrank with it. Families packed up, storefronts closed, and fields like his were left to carry what remained of the town's worth. People whispered about things left behind in those years. Some claimed the government had buried storage vaults beneath farmland, places to hide materials too dangerous or valuable to transport. Others spoke of tunnels that connected the foundry to the river, carved out in secrecy during the 1940s, when fear of invasion made men dig shelters beneath their own barns. Eli had always laughed off such talk, dismissing it as barroom tales that grew taller with every telling. But now, staring at the iron lid that his plow had dragged out of hiding, he couldn't help but wonder. At the diner, men leaned across chip counters and traded stories as easily as they traded sugar packets. One said he remembered a convoy of trucks rumbling down County Road late at night, headlights blacked out, tarps stretched tight over whatever they carried. Another swore his uncle had seen blueprints for underground bunkers drawn up by engineers who never returned after the war. Eli sat in silence during those conversations, sipping his coffee, unwilling to admit that something buried on his farm seemed to give weight to their words. The land itself bore scars that matched the town's memory. In spring, when the rains came heavy, water seeped up carrying flecks of ash, fine and black, remnants of furnaces that had once burned hotter than anything the soil could forget. His father had called them ghost flecks, bits of the foundry that refused to stay buried. Eli had never cared much for those details, but now he found himself staring at the ground differently, as if every patch of earth held some hidden fragment of the past. Nights grew longer, and the rusted hatch in the east field seemed to take on a presence of its own. Eli caught himself imagining what might lie below: crates of forgotten munitions, drums of chemicals, or perhaps just scrap metal sealed away when the war ended. Each possibility carried its own kind of danger. He pictured his grandfather walking those same rows decades earlier, planting corn above a secret he never knew was there. The thought made Eli's chest tighten. It was one thing for rumors to circulate in town, but another for them to take shape in the soil you depended on for your livelihood. He ran his hand along the plow blade one evening, the edge dulled by its violent collision with the buried surface. That sudden jolt had cracked open more than rusted metal. It had cracked open history itself, demanding to be faced. And though Eli told himself he should leave it alone, call the county, let someone else decide what lay beneath, he knew he wouldn't. Something about the weight of the secret felt personal now, woven into his land and his family story. For the first time, the old whispers didn't sound like foolish tales. They sounded like warnings that had gone unheard. The next morning broke with a pale sun and a sky the color of tin, the kind of light that made every breath in the cold air look like smoke. Eli carried the shovel across the yard without speaking to anyone, his boots crunching over frozen dirt as he headed toward the east field. The tractor still sat where he had left it, its tires half sunk into the furrow, the ground frozen around the wound it had opened. He rested the shovel on his shoulder and walked to the spot, staring down at the streak of rust where the soil had been peeled back. What he had glimpsed yesterday had not left his mind all night, keeping him restless. Staring at the ceiling while his wife slept soundly beside him, he set the shovel blade into the earth and began to dig, steady and slow. The soil crumbled away in clumps, damp and cold, until more of the metal showed itself. It stretched wider than he expected, a broad plate hidden just below the topsoil, its surface mottled with orange corrosion. Eli worked the dirt back with deliberate strokes, widening the space around it, the shape emerging like a bone pulled from the ground. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't some discarded scrap from the foundry years. The edges were straight, squared, and solid. His shovel clinked against a seam running across the length of the plate, the sound sharp, hollow, and deliberate. Eli knelt and brushed at the seam with his gloved hand. It ran like a hinge, though rust had fused much of it. His heart gave a quick, nervous thud. This wasn't just metal lying in the ground. It was something built, meant to open and close, and sealed with purpose. At one corner, his fingers traced over the shape of a bolt head, so corroded it blended into the iron itself. When he pressed against it, flakes of rust broke off, exposing a darker thread beneath. Another bolt sat on the opposite corner, just as deliberate, just as sealed. Whoever had put this here had made sure it would stay shut. "Dad!" The voice came from the fence line. Eli looked up to see his son Luke trudging across the field, collar pulled high against the wind. At 20, Luke carried himself with the wiry frame of a young man accustomed to farm labor, shoulders set from years of hauling, hands strong and rough. He hopped the last furrow and stopped when he saw what his father had uncovered. "That doesn't look like rock," he said, his voice uncertain. "It's not," Eli answered quietly. He motioned Luke closer and tapped the shovel against the seam. The sound rang hollow, carrying through the still morning. "That's a hatch." Luke crouched, brushing at the rim with his bare hand despite the cold. His fingertips traced the corroded welds that had once sealed the edges tight. "It's been welded shut," he muttered. "Somebody wanted it buried." Eli leaned on the shovel, his breath rising in steady clouds. "And somebody wanted it kept closed." He studied the bolts again, the rust eating at their heads, but not enough to erase their shape. Weld lines circled the rim, thick and uneven, scarred from heat that had long since cooled. The sight unsettled him. This wasn't debris forgotten by accident. It was an entrance, closed with intent, and hidden beneath the field his family had plowed for generations. Luke sat back on his heels, eyes darting from the hatch to his father. "You think it's one of those bunkers people talk about?" His voice carried the mix of fear and excitement that comes from brushing against rumor turned real. Eli didn't answer right away. He kept his gaze on the hatch, its surface streaked with rust, but still holding the weight of whatever lay beneath. The field felt different now, heavier, as if the soil itself carried a secret no one was meant to disturb. He finally said, "I don't know what it is, but it was put here for a reason." The two of them stood in silence, the wind skimming low the furrows. Beneath their boots lay a door, sealed and buried by hands long gone, waiting for the wrong, or perhaps the right, moment to be found. And though neither said it aloud, both knew that their discovery had turned the Granger field into something more than farmland. It was now an entrance to a past that might have been meant to stay hidden forever. By mid-afternoon, the quiet of the Granger farm was gone. The stillness that usually clung to the east field had been replaced by the low rumble of idling engines and the murmur of voices carrying on the wind. Trucks lined up along the fence row, their tires pressed into frozen ground, exhaust curling into the pale sky. Men leaned against tailgates, arms crossed against the cold, eyes fixed on the same patch of earth where Eli and his son had dug that morning. What had begun as a single jolt of the plow had now become a matter of town interest, and word had moved faster than Eli would have believed possible. It had started with Luke making the mistake of mentioning the hatch at the feed store. By the time Eli returned from town, two neighbors had already come to take a look. They stood with hands on their hips, offering guesses as though their voices might loosen the bolts holding the thing shut. Before long, more trucks rolled in, drawn by rumor, each man and woman bringing their own theories with them. By the time Eli set foot back on property, the fence line was crowded with familiar faces, curiosity outweighing any sense of privacy. Eli stood near the hatch, shovel still in hand. watching the crowd grow. He didn't call them over, but neither did he send them away. A farmer lived by the unspoken rule that news was shared along fences and across diner counters. Now that the ground had given up its secret, it belonged to more than just him. Luke crouched at the rim again, brushing soil away, while Eli tried not to notice the whispers or the way his neighbor's eyes kept shifting between the hatch and his own expression. The sound of tires on gravel drew their attention toward the road. A patrol truck eased into the lane, headlights dim in the winter light. Sheriff Tom Harlan stepped out, coat collar pulled up, notebook in hand. He was a solid man in his 50s, the kind who had grown up with half the men now standing at the fence. His boots crunched over the field as he approached, his expression somewhere between patient and wary. "All right," he said, voice steady as he flipped his notebook open. "Heard there's something out here worth looking at. Figured I'd better see it before the whole county tramples through." Eli pointed to the exposed iron plate. The sheriff crouched, resting one knee in the dirt, and ran his hand along the rim. His fingers traced the corroded welds, the thick seam that cut across the surface. He tapped one of the bolts with the end of his pen, then leaned back, exhaling slow through his nose. "Likely just old storage," he said finally, writing something down. "You know how things were during the war years. Government dug holes everywhere, filled them, sealed them. Could be fuel, could be scrap, could be nothing at all." His words carried the rhythm of reassurance, the practiced tone of a man used to settling nerves before they could become complaints. But Eli caught the way the sheriff's eyes lingered. Too long, too intent, as though he had seen something that didn't match his easy explanation. The neighbors noticed it too, their murmurs rising behind them. The sheriff shut his notebook and straightened, dusting his gloves on his coat. "Best thing," he continued, raising his voice enough for the fence line to hear, "is to leave it alone until the county has a chance to send someone out. Could be dangerous if you go prying at it. Rust like that doesn't hold forever." A few men nodded, but others frowned, restless with the idea of waiting. Curiosity had already taken root, and Eli knew it wouldn't be contained by a few careful words. He saw it in their faces. The same unease that kept him awake last night, now magnified and multiplied across the crowd. The sheriff tipped his hat, signaling an end to the conversation. But the hatch sat silent at their feet, heavy with unanswered questions. The air seemed to grow colder as the sun tilted lower, and Eli felt the weight of every eye still fixed on that spot of ground. Whatever lay beneath had already shifted something larger than his field. The whole town had been drawn to it, and now there was no turning back. By the next morning, the trucks were still there. Some had left in the night, but fresh ones had taken their places, the field's edge looking more like a gathering point than a farm. Eli had risen before sunrise, coffee steaming in his hand, hoping the frost would keep people away. It hadn't. Curiosity in a small town spread quicker than any seed he had ever put into the ground. Men stood in clusters, boots pressed into the frozen earth. Women with scarves pulled tight around their faces leaned on tailgates, all of them waiting for something to happen. It was Luke who spotted the county car pulling into the drive. The emblem on the door wasn't law enforcement this time, but the seal of the county historical office. When the door opened, Dr. Martha Kell stepped out, her wool coat buttoned to the throat, a satchel tucked under her arm. She was a tall woman in her 60s, with white hair that refused to be tamed, and a sharpness in her eyes that unsettled generations of school children who mistook her for a mere librarian. Those who knew her better understood she carried the town's memory in the margins of her notes, the kind of person who could tell you what stood on any given acre 50 years before you were born. "Morning, Eli," she said as she reached the fence, her breath clouding the air. Sheriff called. Said you might have dug up a piece of our past. Eli nodded, motioning her toward the field. Together they walked to the hatch, the crowd pressing closer behind them. The metal plate lay uncovered, its seams outlined by frost, bolts glinting faintly under the pale light. Martha crouched without hesitation, her knees creaking but steady, and ran her gloved hand across the corroded welds. She leaned closer, tracing the rim as though it might whisper something if she listened hard enough. "Not farm equipment," she said flatly. "Not drainage, either. Too deliberate. This was made to be closed." She looked up at Eli, eyes narrowing. "You ever hear your grandfather mention anything out here?" Eli shook his head. His grandfather had talked about the foundry, about strikes and shifts, about ration lines during the war, but never about anything buried beneath these fields. Martha stood and opened her satchel, pulling out a ledger wrapped in wax paper to protect it from the damp. She flipped through careful pages. The ink faded but legible in her precise hand. Back in the 40s, she said, "I found references to something called Project Ashfield in the county records. Just scraps and ledgers. Entries about materials diverted, concrete poured, labor requisitioned. Nothing that said what it was for." The note stopped suddenly in 1947. No explanations. No follow-up. The crowd shifted uneasily. Someone muttered about government secrets, another about the war factories, leaving behind things better left untouched. Martha kept reading aloud, her finger tracing faded lines. It mentioned agricultural tracts, land bought cheap during the war, sometimes leased from farmers. They were supposed to return it once projects ended. But she closed the ledger with a snap, the sound sharp against the silence. "I never found anything about this property. Not one mention of the Granger land." Luke glanced at his father, his face pale despite the cold. "So this isn't supposed to be here?" Martha looked back at the hatch, her expression grim. If it was part of Project Ashfield, it was buried without the county's knowledge. Either records were destroyed or never written down. That tells me someone wanted it forgotten. The sheriff, who had arrived again with her, scribbled in his notebook but said nothing. His silence carried more weight than any reassurance he had offered the day before. The crowd murmured louder now, the tension spreading like frost across glass. Eli felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. His farm had become the center of something larger, something that reached back into years marked by war and secrecy. He had only wanted to turn his soil, to prepare the ground for winter, but instead, he had torn open a seam stitched shut by hands long gone. Martha closed her ledger and placed it carefully back in her satchel. "You'll need state records to dig deeper," she said, her tone heavy, "and maybe beyond that. But understand this, Eli, whatever's under there was hidden for a reason, and reasons like that usually come with danger attached." The hatch sat silent at their feet, the frost melting slowly off its rim, as if the ground itself was listening. For the first time, Eli wished he had left the plow where it stopped and turned back without looking. But it was too late. The secret was uncovered, and now the whole town stood waiting for what would come next. The decision was not made in one breath. Eli had spent 2 nights lying awake, listening to the old house creak against the wind, hearing his wife stir beside him while he stared at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hatch in the field, rusted, silent, but waiting. The sheriff's warnings echoed in his mind, and Martha Kell's grave words about things meant to be forgotten pressed down like a weight on his chest. Yet the crowd had not thinned. Every day more trucks lined the fence. More voices whispered about what lay beneath. And Luke, his son, carried a restless determination in his eyes, as if walking away would leave him marked with the shame of fear. So, on the 3rd morning, father and son walked back to the field carrying tools instead of excuses. A grinder and acetylene torch, wrenches heavy with grease. The hatch sat cold in the pale light, its bolts swollen with rust, welds cracked but stubborn. Men shifted on their boots. Women pressed scarves tighter to their faces, and children perched on tailgates, wide-eyed and hushed. The sheriff stood near the fence again, arms folded, his silence more telling than words. Martha Kell lingered with her ledger in hand, though she kept her eyes on the hatch as if it might tell her more than ink ever had. Eli set the grinder against the first bolt. The machine whined, and sparks scattered into the cold air, bright against the frost. The sound cut to the murmurs, drawing everyone into silence. The bolt glowed red, flakes of rust dropping away like embers. Luke steadied the edge of the pry bar, his jaw set, sweat rising on his brow despite the chill. One by one they worked the bolts, the grinder's cry followed by the sharpness of the torch. Metal protested, groaning under the heat until each stubborn fastener surrendered. The smell of burning rust and scorched paint drifted over the crowd, acrid and unsettling, a taste of something old forced into the present. When the last bolt gave way, Eli paused, his hands trembling slightly on the wrench. He glanced at Luke, whose face was lit with the orange glow of the torch, eyes steady and unflinching. Together they braced themselves at the rim and pried. The metal resisted at first, the welds clinging with desperate strength, then gave a long, low groan that rolled across the field like a buried beast rousing from sleep. The ground seemed to vibrate underfoot as the hatch lifted an inch, then two, hinges shrieking against decades of silence. The moment it broke free, the air changed. A hiss escaped from the dark below, soft at first, then steady, carrying with it a breath that had been trapped for generations. The crowd pulled back instinctively, scarves pressed to faces, hands raised to mouths. What drifted out was not the clean scent of turned soil, but something stale, metallic, laced with a chemical sharpness that stung the nose and tightened the throat. Eli felt it claw at the back of his lungs, and he covered his mouth with his sleeve, his eyes watering. No one spoke. The torch had gone silent. The grinder stilled, yet the field seemed louder than it ever had before. The hatch yawned open, its mouth spilling cold, sour air into the winter day. Luke coughed, stepping back, his pry bar clattering to the ground. Even the sheriff, who had stood steady through all of it, shifted uneasily, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to press against his face. Eli leaned closer, peering into the black below. The stale breath seemed endless, a draft of something that had waited too long underground. For the first time, he felt the weight of what Martha had said, hidden for a reason. He glanced back at the crowd and saw his neighbors' faces pale, their eyes reflecting not just curiosity now, but fear. Whatever had been sealed under his soil was no longer content to stay buried. It had exhaled into the open world, and with it came the knowledge that nothing about the Granger farm or the town that gathered around it would remain untouched. The hatch yawned open in the brittle morning light, its hinges groaning as though the earth itself disapproved of what had been disturbed. The crowd had pulled back several yards, scarves pressed over mouths, eyes watering from the stale, chemical breath that continued to seep upward. The sheriff stood at the edge longer than anyone else, one gloved hand gripping the rim of the hatch, his jaw set in a line that betrayed both caution and resolve. In his other hand, he held an old brass lantern borrowed from the firehouse, its glass clean but still smudged with smoke stains from past use. Best not to wait, he muttered, more to himself than to those behind him. The words hung in the frosted air, and without waiting for permission, Sheriff Hayes struck a match against the lantern's base. The wick flared, light flickering across his face. The glow was weak against the pale sky, but when he lowered it toward the opening, it cast a trembling circle into the dark below. A ladder of iron rungs clung to the wall, slick with rust, vanishing into shadow. The lantern's glow reached the floor only faintly, bouncing off the outlines of stacked forms, rectangles and cylinders that did not belong in any farmer's field. Hayes crouched at the rim, angling the light deeper. Crates were piled against the far wall, their lids stenciled with faded markings. Next to them stood barrels sealed tight, their tops stamped with symbols half swallowed by corrosion. And in the center of the floor, worn but unmistakable, lay the outline of an eagle clutching arrows, the letters U.S. etched bold beside it. The sheriff exhaled slowly, the sound muffled by the cloth pulled over his face. He turned to Eli, whose boots remained planted firmly in the soil, shovel still in hand. "Looks like military," Hayes said, his voice low. "Not recent, either. Been down there longer than most of us have been alive." Luke edged forward despite his father's warning hand, his eyes, wide with a mix of fear and fascination, fixed on the insignia below. "So it's true," he whispered. "The bunkers, they're real." No one corrected him. The crowd pressed closer again, pulled forward by curiosity stronger than their unease. Hayes tested the first rung with his boot. The ladder groaned but held. He began his descent slowly, lantern swaying with each careful step, until the light swallowed him whole. The field above fell into silence, broken only by the soft scrape of metal as he moved lower. When his boots touched the floor, the sheriff lifted the lantern high. Dust swirled in the glow, disturbed for the first time in decades. The chamber spread wider than expected, the ceiling reinforced with concrete beams stained by moisture. The air was heavy, sour with the scent of old oil and chemicals that had long since lost their purpose. Hayes walked to the nearest crate, brushing his glove over its surface. His light revealed faded stencils, numbers, codes, and a warning triangle dull with time. He did not open it. Instead, he turned slowly in a circle, letting the lantern's beam move across the barrels and boxes, revealing row after row of storage. From above, Eli called down, his voice hollow against the concrete. "What do you see?" Hayes paused before answering, his eyes settling once more on the insignia stamped into the floor. "History," he said finally, "and maybe something worse." His voice carried upward, and it silenced even the murmurs at the fence line. The lantern flickered, its glow bouncing across barrels that no one recognized, crates that no one wanted to claim. The sheriff stood alone in the chamber, a single figure surrounded by the remnants of a forgotten project, and above him the town held its breath. Whatever this place had been meant for, it was clear it had not been meant to be found again. The lantern's glow trembled against the concrete walls as Sheriff Hayes stood in the chamber, its dim circle pushing back only enough shadow to reveal the outlines of what lay forgotten. Crates stacked like bricks of another era lined one wall. They were darkened and swollen with time. He ran a gloved hand over the nearest, the grain rough beneath decades of dust. The stencils faded but not gone. There were numbers, rows of them, and words he could barely make out. Supply codes, perhaps, or warnings written for men who had never returned. He hesitated, lantern swaying in his other hand, then turned back toward the hatch above. "Eli," he called, his voice carrying through the stale air. "Bring that pry bar down here." The request stirred movement overhead. Eli's had appeared at the rim of the hatch, his son Luke right behind him, their faces pale in the thin light. They exchanged a glance, then lowered the bar down carefully, the iron clanging softly against the ladder as it descended. Hayes caught it, the weight solid in his hands. For a moment, he simply held it, the crowd above watching in complete silence, before he slid the bar beneath the edge of the crate's lid. Wood groaned as he pried, the nails screaming in protest. Dust burst into the air as the lid shifted, a plume of gray rising like a ghost disturbed from sleep. Hayes coughed, pulling his cloth tighter over his mouth, then leaned his weight harder on the bar. With a sharp crack, the crate's lid split loose, the sound echoing against the chamber walls. The crowd above gasped, the sound rippling through the cold air as if the whole town had inhaled at once. He lifted the lantern closer, its glow spilling over the contents. Inside were metal drums smaller than oil barrels but sealed tight, their surfaces painted once bright but now dulled and pitted. Symbols in red, triangles, skull-like markings, warnings he didn't fully recognize, stood out against the rust. Next to them were bundles wrapped in heavy brown paper, tied with twine that had gone brittle but still held. Hayes brushed his glove across one and revealed faded lettering. Restricted property of U.S. Army. Beneath the wrapping, the outline of files and folders was unmistakable. Records, documents sealed away with the same care as the drums. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat. He pulled the lantern back quickly and turned his head toward the hatch. Everyone stepped back. His voice rang sharp, louder than it had been all day. Move back from the opening now. But above him, the opposite happened. The people pressed closer to the rim, boots grinding into the soil, hands gripping the edge of the hatch as if they could see more by leaning in. Fear and curiosity wrestled across their faces, and curiosity was winning. A woman clutched her scarf to her nose, but refused to move back. Men exchanged whispers, their eyes darting between Hayes below and Eli standing helpless at the edge of the crowd. "I said back." Hayes barked again, the force of authority in his tone. The lantern trembled in his grip, sending shadows twitching across the chamber walls. "We don't know what this is, and until we do, no one gets closer." His words seemed to hang in the cold air, but the command was not enough to erase the hunger in the crowd's eyes. They had waited through days of rumors and restless nights, and now the truth was finally within reach. The sheriff's warning felt like another secret being kept from them, and secrets had already poisoned the ground under their feet. Hayes turned back to the open crate, staring at the sealed drums and paper-wrapped files. His gut told him they should be sealed again, buried where no one could stumble on them. But the earth had already yielded them once, and the eyes above would never let it be undone. The stale air pressed heavy against his lungs as he lowered the lantern further, watching the red stencils glow in the shifting light. Behind him, the sound of boots on the ladder rattled through the chamber. Luke was climbing down, ignoring his father's hand reaching to stop him. Hayes swore under his breath, the bar still clutched in his fist. The boy's boots hit the floor with a hollow thud, his face pale but burning with the reckless determination of youth. He stepped beside the sheriff, his eyes fixed on the open crate. The drums sat silently, their surfaces sweating faint moisture in the lantern's glow, as though the cold walls themselves were trying to hold them back. The files seemed to whisper with their silence, promises of answers or dangers that had been hidden for reasons none of them yet understood. Above, the crowd shifted restlessly, the weight of their presence pressing down as surely as the soil had once done. The Granger farm was no longer just a farm. It had become the stage for something older, darker, and far larger than the town itself. And the first crate was only the beginning. The air in the chamber was already sour, thick with the scent of metal and rot. When Luke bent closer to one of the drums, his hand hovered, hesitant but curious, as though proximity alone might reveal its purpose. Sheriff Hayes caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and snapped, "Don't touch it." The command came sharp, but it was too late. The boy's boot had nudged the crate just enough that one of the barrels shifted against its neighbor. The sound was small, just a dull scrape of rusted metal on wood. Then came the hiss. A thin, white vapor slipped from a hairline crack along the drum seam, curling upward like a snake disturbed in its den. At first it was barely visible, only a faint shimmer in the lantern's glow. But then the vapor thickened, spilling faster, its tendrils clawing into the cold air with purpose. Hayes jerked back, pulling Luke with him, but the damage had already begun. Where the vapor touched the soil, the ground hissed in reply. Dark patches spread quickly, the earth sizzling as though it had been dropped into a skillet. Acrid smoke coiled upward, biting at their eyes, stinging their lungs. Hayes pulled his kerchief tight over his mouth, coughing into the fabric. Luke gagged beside him, his eyes watering. His body bent forward as he struggled for breath. The lantern flickered, light bending in the haze, shadows stretching and recoiling against the walls. Above, the crowd had seen the first curls of smoke rise through the hatch. Murmurs turned to shouts as people stumbled back from the rim. A woman screamed when the vapor reached her, thin wisps stinging her throat. Men pressed coats to their faces, voices muffled but panicked, calling for children, calling for trucks. One neighbor clutched his chest and staggered away, dropping to his knees before collapsing entirely. His wife knelt beside him, her cries tearing across the frozen field. Hayes fumbled for the radio at his belt, his gloves slicked with sweat despite the cold. Static burst into the chamber as he pressed the button. His voice was rough, strained, but steady enough to cut through the noise. "This is Sheriff Hayes, Anvil Creek. We have a hazardous materials breach at the Granger farm. Immediate response needed. Repeat, hazardous breach. Send fire. Send hazmat. Send anyone you've got." His words rattled into the void, the reply delayed by distance, but he knew it would come. He clung to that certainty even as his lungs burned. Eli had dropped to ground above, pulling his neighbor's limp body away from the spreading smoke, his face grim beneath the scarf wrapped tight. He shouted orders, telling people to move toward the road, to keep their children close, but panic spread faster than discipline. Engines roared as some tried to leave, trucks spinning in the frozen dirt, others abandoning vehicles altogether in their rush to escape. The fence line became chaos, the once watchful crowd scattering in every direction, their breath clouding the air as they fled the unseen danger. In the chamber below, the hiss of the drum grew louder, more insistent as the crack widened. Hayes knew they couldn't stay. He shoved Luke toward the ladder, barking, "Climb, now!" The boy obeyed, scrambling upward with desperate speed. Hayes followed, lantern swinging wildly as he pulled himself rung by rung, the fumes rising behind him like a living thing determined to catch them. When they reached the surface, the air above was no longer clean, but still bearable. Hayes pulled the hatch cover closed as far as it would go, though it resisted, rust grinding against rust. He coughed into his sleeve, his lungs raw, and looked at Eli. "Keep them back," he rasped. "Nobody comes near this field." The farmer nodded, his face pale, his hand steady only, because they had to be. Around them, the field that had once been silent farmland was now a scene of chaos. Neighbors scattering, one man lying unconscious, smoke twisting into the winter sky. And beneath the earth, the drums hissed on, their secret finally tasting open air. By the time the sun dipped below the hills, the east field no longer felt like a farm. Smoke still hung in the air, a bitter trace of whatever had hissed out from the cracked drum. The sheriff's radio had crackled all afternoon. Voices of dispatchers and county responders tangled with orders that seemed to climb higher than any of them expected. People stayed at a distance now, huddled in small clusters along the road, headlights glowing in the dusk. They didn't leave, though. Curiosity kept them tethered, even as fear gnawed at the edges of their resolve. The Granger farm had become something larger than itself, and no one wanted to miss what came next. The first vehicles appeared as shadows, their engines low and deliberate. No sirens, no markings, just dark vans rolling in one after another, headlights cutting through the haze. They moved with the precision of a column, stopping in formation at the edge of the field. Doors opened in unison, and men stepped out, dressed in plain suits and heavy coats, their expressions unreadable. They carried no badges on their chests, no insignia on their shoulders, but the way they moved left little doubt about their authority. Sheriff Hayes met them halfway across the field, his boots crunching over the frozen furrows. He spoke low, his hands gesturing toward the hatch, but the suited men barely looked at him. Their leader, a tall figure with a clipboard tucked under his arm, nodded once, then snapped a short order. More men moved to the vehicles, pulling rolls of bright fencing and metal posts. In minutes, the field was being cordoned off, a new perimeter rising where a crowd had gathered all day. Protests began almost immediately. A farmer shouted that this was private land. Another demanded to know what had been uncovered. A woman clutched her scarf tighter and cried out about the man who had collapsed earlier in the fumes. But the suited men gave no answers. Their voices were clipped mechanical, issuing instructions as though the people of Anvil Creek were obstacles rather than witnesses. Step back. Leave the area. This is restricted. The same phrases repeated, delivered without warmth, without variation. Phones appeared in the crowd, screens glowing in the dark as neighbors tried to capture what was happening. Within moments, those phones were seized. The men in suits moved with practiced efficiency, confiscating cameras, demanding memory cards, deleting images without explanation. One man refused, clutching his device to his chest. Two of the strangers flanked him, their words too low to hear, but their meaning clear enough. The phone was taken. The man was left standing, shaken, his voice caught in his throat. Eli stood near the fence, his hands clenched into fists, watching strangers march across land his family had tilled for generations. Luke stood beside him, pale but rigid, his eyes darting between the unmarked vans and the glow of floodlights now being set up around the hatch. The east field was no longer theirs. It had been claimed by silence and authority that answered to no one in town. Martha Kell stood at the roadside, her ledger clutched tight against her chest. She asked questions in a clear voice, demanding records, citations, names. No one gave her so much as a glance. The men worked quickly, unrolling cables, setting up equipment, their faces blank to every protest. Hayes returned to the fence line, his face heavy with defeat. He did not need to speak. His silence told the crowd what they already feared. Whatever had been uncovered now belonged to powers far beyond the county's reach. By nightfall, the field glowed under harsh artificial light. The hatch was ringed with machinery, the unmarked men moving in and out of his mouth like ants entering a nest. The townsfolk lingered in the dark beyond the fence, their breath fogging in the cold, their whispers carrying into the night. The questions grew louder, angrier, but none were answered. The only certainty was that the Granger farm had slipped out of their hands, swallowed by something that came with vans, with silence, and with authority stamped in shadows. The diner had always been the town's gathering place, its walls steeped in decades of smoke, coffee, and conversation. But after the events of the Granger farm, the air inside carried a new charge. Every booth was filled, every stool at the counter occupied, and the steady clatter of plates and utensils was drowned beneath a rising tide of speculation. No one spoke casually anymore. Each word seemed sharpened, clipped with urgency, as if answers might appear if only they were discussed long enough. Chemical weapons? A man muttered over his mug, his voice low but insistent. Has to be. Why else were they coming like that? Sealing everything off. They don't show up for nothing. Across the room, another leaned forward, elbows pressed hard against the table. It's not weapons. It's money. Gold, maybe. Heard they hid bullion out here during the war. Moved it from a coast so it couldn't be hit by bombers. That explained the crates, the guards, the silence. His words drew nods from some, scoffs from others. At the counter, a group of farmers huddled close, their faces shadowed beneath the brim of caps. Their talk was quieter, their eyes darting toward the door as though someone might overhear. They spoke not of gold or weapons, but of soil, of crops, of the future. If that stuff leaked, one said, his hand clenched around his coffee cup. What's it done to the ground? What's it done to our fields? Another shook his head, jaw tight. You think they'll tell us? Not a chance. We'll be the last to know if the land's poisoned. Mothers gathered near the windows. Children pressed close to their sides. Their voices carried worry more than anger. They spoke of keeping kids indoors, of pulling them from school if the smoke spread, of what they had seen with their own eyes. The man collapsing in the field, the acrid haze curling into the sky. Their fear softened into anger when they spoke of Eli, though it came wrapped in unease rather than accusation. His name threaded through every booth, every whispered conversation. Eli Granger, the farmer whose plow had struck the hatch, the man who had stirred the soil and uncovered what should have remained hidden. Some spoke his name with blame. If he'd left well enough alone, we wouldn't be in this mess. Others spoke it with awe, took courage to dig it up, to face whatever was buried there. Most spoke it with uncertainty, caught between resentment and respect, between fear of what had come and the sense that Eli had somehow carried the burden of history onto his shoulders. Martha Kell sat alone at a booth near the back, her ledger spread open, her pencil moving in slow strokes across the page. She didn't add to the rumors, didn't hush them either. Her ears caught every thread of speculation, but her focus remained on the fragments of records she had already uncovered. She knew more than most, but not enough. Not nearly enough to settle the panic that gripped the town. Even the waitresses moved differently, their trays trembling in their hands, their eyes darting toward the windows where the glow of floodlights still painted the horizon outside of town. The Granger farm was visible even from here, a distant smear of unnatural brightness against the dark fields, a reminder that the secret beneath the soil was no longer just Eli's problem, but the town's burden. Sheriff Hayes entered near closing, his presence quiet, but commanding enough to pull every gaze in the room. He didn't sit. He didn't order. He simply stood by the door, his eyes moving over the gathered faces. No one asked him for answers. They already knew he wouldn't give them. But his silence, the heaviness of it, was an answer in itself. The town was on its own, left to speculate, to fear, to wonder. As the night deepened, the buzz inside the diner never settled. It rose and fell like a storm tide, waves of rumor crashing against the walls. Chemical weapons, gold, documents too dangerous to read. Some darker thing no one dared to name aloud. And through it all, Eli's name lingered like smoke, threading to the air until it clung to every ear. Blame, awe, or fear, it didn't matter. He had become the center of their unease. The farmer who turned the soil and unearthed the past the town had tried to forget. The county archive was not a place many visited anymore. Its brick walls had weathered into a muted red, and the tall windows had gathered a permanent haze of dust, filtering the light into dim, yellow beams. Rows of cabinets and stacks of forgotten boxes filled the air with the smell of paper, mildew, and ink long dried. Dr. Martha Kell knew every aisle and every drawer, her life's work stitched into the cataloging of records that others would have dismissed as irrelevant. But tonight, she moved with a sharper urgency. The whispers in the diner, the smoke from the Granger farm, the unmarked vans under harsh floodlights, none of it made sense without the paper trail. And Martha believed the past always left a trail. Her fingers, stiff in the chill of the unheated archive, trailed along the spine of ledgers bound in crumbling leather. The year markers faded into obscurity, 1941, 1943, 1945, each volume heavy with the business of a county bending under the weight of war. She pulled one free, the dust rising in a cloud, and carried it to a wooden table that creaked beneath its weight. Carefully, she spread the cover open. The handwriting was neat, tight lines of ink pressed by clerks who had not known the importance of the details they recorded. At first, the entries were routine: shipments of steel to the foundry, allocations of fuel, ration logs. Then her pencil stopped mid-page. The words Project Ashfield were written in bolder ink, underlined twice. Her heart quickened as she leaned closer. The entry listed expenditures diverted from normal accounts: cement, steel reinforcement bars, seal drums. Next to it, a notation: storage beneath agricultural tracts. Her lips moved as she read the words aloud, the sound thin in the empty room. Agricultural tracts. Farmland. The Granger farm had been listed in those years as one of the largest still operating near town. She turned the page, her eyes racing over more entries. Payments to unnamed contractors. Labor requisitioned and dismissed within weeks. The word sealed, repeated again and again, paired with numbers that no longer meant anything without their keys. Her hand shook as she scribbled notes in the margin of her ledger, each fragment tying back to the hatch in Eli's East Field. They had buried something during the war, sealed it beneath soil meant to grow crops, and left no explanation as to why. Then, abruptly, the record broke. The last entry began in the same careful hand: Project Ashfield, containment complete, awaiting transfer of... And there it ended, the line cut off mid-sentence, the ink trailing into nothing as though the pen had been pulled away or the writer interrupted. Martha flipped the page, and another, but the ledger fell silent. No follow-up, no closure, just blank space where explanation should have been. She sat back in a wooden chair, the silence of the archive pressing down like weight. Her breath fogged faintly in the cold, and she realized her hands were trembling, not from age this time, but from the unease curling inside her chest. To find gaps in the record was rare, but to find one like this, sliced clean, deliberate, was worse. Someone had meant to erase the ending. Someone had wanted the story unfinished. Closing the ledger carefully, she pressed her palm flat against its worn cover, as if the warmth of her skin might coax out what the ink had refused to tell. Project Ashfield, 50 years sealed, storage beneath farmland, a transfer that never appeared in writing. She thought of the drums hissing in the Granger chamber, the acrid smoke curling into the winter air, the man who had collapsed on the soil. The past was not past. It was breathing again, leaking into the present, and no record could bind it back into silence. Martha gathered her notes, her satchel heavy as she slung it over her shoulder. The glow of floodlights was faint even here, bleeding into the night from the direction of the farm. She paused at the doorway of the archive, the ledger still clutched against her chest. The county had recorded the birth of Project Ashfield, but not its death. And that absence, she knew, was not neglect but intent. She locked the door behind her, the metallic click echoing too loud in the dark hall, and stepped into the night with a certainty that what had been hidden beneath the Granger soil was never meant to be found. By the following evening, the East Field looked more like a military outpost than farmland. Floodlights burned against the darkness, casting long beams across the frost-stiff rows. A chain-link fence had gone up in less than a day, stretching in a wide circle that claimed not just a hatch, but a good portion of Eli's land. Trucks idled at the perimeter, their engines humming low, while men in plain coats walked back and forth with radios pressed to their mouths. The air was alive with the mechanical buzz of generators, the hard crackle of orders, and the distant murmur of townsfolk who refused to leave. They came in groups, walking from their homes, driving battered pickups that lined the roadside. At first they lingered at the fence line, their voices low, their eyes fixed on the lights that turned familiar farmland into something alien. But soon whispers became questions, and questions turned to demands. "What's in there?" one man shouted, his voice carrying across the metal. "You don't get to just take a man's land." Others pressed closer, their breath steaming in the cold. Mothers clutched their children back, yet still stayed within earshot, unwilling to turn away from the secret growing louder by the hour. Sheriff Hayes tried to hold the line, his hands raised, palms out, his voice calm but firm. "You all need to step back," he said. "This isn't the place for answers right now. Let them do their work." But his words barely carried over floodlights hum, and the faces staring back at him were tired of patience. They wanted truth, not reassurances that had gone stale. When he tried to move closer to the fence, one of the suited men intercepted him. Their exchange was quiet at first, the sheriff leaning in, gesturing toward the crowd, toward a land that by rights was his to protect. But the man in the suit shook his head once, curt and dismissive, and then stepped forward. His arm went out, barring the sheriff himself from crossing what had become a new boundary. The meaning was unmistakable. Even the law of the county had been pushed back, stripped of its authority at its own border. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, his silence heavier than protest. The crowd saw it and grew louder. Rumors spread like sparks in dry grass. Some said the field was leaking poison, that crops would never grow again, that the water was already tainted. Others swore it was gold, that the federal men were hauling away riches meant for town. A few spoke in hushed tones about experiments, about things buried because they were too dangerous to be seen in daylight. Each theory wound tighter into the next, passed from ear to ear until no one knew where truth ended and fear began. Eli stood apart near the fence, his hat pulled low, his breath sharp in the cold. He heard his name spoken again and again, tangled in the rumors. To some, he was the man who had brought disaster by turning his plow where it didn't belong. To others, he was the one who had forced the truth into daylight, no matter the cost. Neither version felt like him, but he carried them both silent, while the agents worked under the harsh glow of the lights. As night deepened, the crowd pressed tighter to the fence. Their questions grew sharper, their voices rising above the hum of generators. The men in suits did not answer. They moved with the same mechanical precision as before, their faces turned away from the anger just beyond the chain link. The divide between townsfolk and outsiders had become more than a fence. It was a wound cut to the heart of the county, and with each passing hour it deepened. The floodlights washed the Granger field in hard white glare, the kind that erased shadows but created its own kind of darkness. Beyond the chain-link fence, the town had thinned to only the stubborn, the sleepless, and the young. Most families had returned home under the sheriff's urging, but not all. Curiosity burned brightest in those who had the least to lose and the most to prove. By midnight, a cluster of teenagers huddled at the tree line, their breaths steaming in the cold, their whispers quick with nerves. Phones in hand, they recorded shaky glimpses of the fence perimeter. Men in plain suits moved briskly under the lights, their silhouettes sharp against the glow. Machinery hummed, generators rattled, and every so often metallic thud carried across the frosted field. From where the teenagers crouched, the sound was like a pulse, steady and unnerving. "They're hauling something out," one boy muttered, adjusting the focus on his phone. The others leaned closer. Through the fence, under the floodlights, agents wrestled with containers, long, rectangular, sealed with heavy clasps. The crates moved from the open hatch to waiting trucks in a steady rhythm, as if rehearsed. The teenagers crept closer, weaving through the trees until they reached the far side of the fence where the guards' eyes didn't linger. One slipped a boot under the lowest rung, lifting the mesh just enough to crawl beneath. The others followed, hearts pounding, the cold soil damp against their palms. Inside the perimeter, the light was harsher, the air thicker. Every sound they made seemed too loud, though the constant drone of generators masked their scuffs and breaths. Phones lifted again, they filmed as close as they dared. The images were shaky but undeniable. Men hauling sealed containers, the stencils on sides blurred with age but still marked with symbols. One teenager zoomed in on the faded red triangles and skull-like warnings. Another whispered, "This isn't gold. This is something else." Then came the mistake. A crate slipped from the grip of two agents as they struggled to heave it onto a truck. It fell hard, the wood splitting, the sound cracking across the night like a gunshot. The teenagers froze, their cameras catching every second. The lid gave way, and from inside spilled a glint of something metallic. Not dull and rusted like the drums they had glimpsed earlier, but sharp, clean, unnervingly well-preserved. Pieces clattered onto the ground, catching the floodlight as they scattered. One agent cursed, another barked an order, and within moments more men rushed forward, forming a wall of bodies around the breach. The teenagers' videos caught fragments, a flash of curved metal, a glimpse of stamped lettering, a reflection too bright to be forgotten. Then came the shouting. Guards spread outward, their voices clipped, their radios alive with static commands. The teenagers ducked low, hearts hammering, and fled the way they had come, crawling back on the fence, sprinting for the cover of trees. By dawn, the footage was online. Shaky clips showed the crates, the spill of metallic fragments, the panic of agents scrambling to contain it. The town awoke to a flood of messages, phones buzzing on kitchen tables, screens glowing with images no one could deny. But just as quickly as it spread, it vanished. Links broke. Videos went dark. Accounts were suspended. By mid-morning, nothing remained but fragments saved by those quick enough to download. At the diner, whispers spread again, sharper than ever. Some swore the metallic glint was weaponry. Others said it looked like coins, or worse, parts of something never meant to be seen. The truth had been caught, if only for a moment, and erased by hands as practiced at burying secrets as the ones that sealed the hatch decades ago. By the time the week ended, the Granger farm no longer looked like a place where crops had ever grown. The floodlights still blazed against the night sky, but the rhythm of work had changed. Trucks came and went in steady intervals, their beds weighed down with crates and sealed drums, their tires carving ruts into soil that had once been steady ground for planting. The smell lingered in the air, metallic, chemical, a bitter tang that clung to the throat long after leaving the fence line. The county posted signs at every approach road. Restricted area. No entry. Trespassers would face arrest. The words looked foreign against the familiar backdrop of fields and barns. Eli stood at the fence each day, his boots planted in soil that was his name, but no longer in truth. His hands, rough from decades of work, curled around the cold chain links. He said little, only watching his men. He did not know to dismantle the land he had been raised to tend. Luke stood beside him sometimes, his youth burning with anger that had no outlet. But Eli's silence was heavier than shouting. He had seen what came from breaking the ground, from prying into places left closed. His calloused palms felt useless now, empty, as though everything he'd ever built or tilled had been stripped away by a single collision of plow against hidden iron. The town adjusted in ways that felt more like retreat than resilience. Farmers tested their wells twice a day, holding the water up to the light as though their eyes alone could reveal poison. Mothers pulled their children inside when the wind shifted, closing windows against air they no longer trusted. At the diner, conversation faltered whenever new faces entered, outsiders, officials, men with clipped voices who carried the air of authority, but left only more questions behind. Speculation had burned itself into exhaustion. People still talked of gold, of weapons, of lost projects from wartime, but now their voices were quieter, their words edged with defeat. Martha Kell no longer brought her ledger into public view. She kept her notes at home, pages filled with fragments of the past that seemed to explain less the more she uncovered. The blank space where the story had ended in 1947 haunted her more than the words that came before. She walked past the diner windows with her satchel close to her side, her gaze lowered, unwilling to fan the flames of rumor with the little she knew. The sheriff stopped answering questions altogether. His silence was not the silence of ignorance, but of someone pushed past the edge of his authority. He drove the perimeter daily, watching the floodlights blink against the horizon, but the land was no longer his to guard. The people saw in his face, and they stopped pressing for answers he could never give. Eli's neighbors began to treat him differently. Some avoided him, unwilling to meet the eyes of the man who had unearthed what should have been left buried. Others sought him out quietly, offering condolences disguised as small talk, their voices carrying a kind of reverence. In every whisper his name carried weight, either as the man who had doomed the soil or as the one who had borne its hidden truth into the light. Neither version sat right with him. The field beyond the fence grew scarred with machinery, its furrows replaced by tire tracks and dug trenches. The soil itself looked wounded, patches stained dark where smoke had curled, grass refusing to grow near the edges. The land that had once held promise of spring planting now felt cursed, stripped of its innocence. When the last trucks left one evening, carrying away the final containers under tarps pulled tight, Eli stood at the fence long after the engines faded. The floodlights dimmed, one by one, until only the winter stars remained. His hand slipped from the chain link, falling heavy at his sides. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that pressed against the ears and made the breath sound too loud. What lingered was not closure, but vacancy. The land was declared off-limits, its ownership reduced to a word on a deed that meant nothing against the weight of federal orders. The soil was left poisoned, the truth carried away in convoys, and the town left behind with only memory. A memory of a plow striking iron, of a hatch groaning open, of a breath in the earth that should never been released. Eli turned back toward his house, the frost crunching under his boots. Behind him, the field lay quiet, its secret gone but its scars permanent. The silence was worse than the noise. It carried the certainty that whatever had been unearthed had changed them all, and that no one would ever know the whole would have been taken from beneath their soil.